First of all, thank you to the Academy for giving us the opportunity to share this piece. My name is Irene. In this short video, I'd like to share our study in which we investigate the drivers of corporate social performance in emerging economies. In addition to this short video, we will also have live presentation scheduled for 8th of July starting at 11 a.m. Central European Time. We welcome you all to this live showcase as well. For those who are less familiar with the topic, I will frequently mention CSP throughout this presentation, which stands for Corporate Social Performance. And to begin with, I will start by briefly explaining the motivation of this research. This study is motivated by an increasing attention on the importance of CSP for sustainable development. While in general we would expect companies to build CSP because of the financial benefit from doing so, in multiple studies, scholars observe a low CSP, especially in emerging economies. One of the reasons is because the expected financial incentive could be less. Another possible explanation is because the institutional voids in emerging economies would weaken stakeholder demand for CSP. This explains why putting in place a mandate to build CSP appears to be not really effective in the emerging economies. For instance, the execution of Section 135 of India's Companies Act, which mandates 2% of average corporate profit for CSP. Yet, scholars found that only less than half of the large and influential Indian companies conform to this mandate. There is also a possibility that managers are familiar with business practices in relatively weak institutional environment, thus would not commit in building CSP. This last reason is pertinent to the emerging market multinationals. So in summary, while we recognize the importance of CSP to the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals, seems like we cannot expect a high CSP in emerging economies. But fortunately, there are increasing evidence of a high CSP in emerging economies, in particular of the emerging market multinationals. And here are a few examples that can be found from the literature. In a study that compares CSP of domestic companies and the emerging market multinationals, scholars observed that internationalization could play an important role in modifying commitments towards CSP. In another study, scholars found evidence that the emerging market multinationals invest in CSP both in the developed countries and in their Latin American operations. Similarly, scholars reported a high CSP of Samsung Electronics as the Korean multinationals expand to the emerging markets such as China. This unusual display of behavior towards CSP, especially of the emerging market multinationals, makes us question what drives CSP in emerging economies, given the low institutional quality and managers' familiarity with culture and way of doing business in relatively weak institutional environment. To answer this question, we illustrate CSP as a case of resource contingency in which companies deploy slack resources into various activities in the social domain. Similar to other strategic decisions that involves corporate resources, the deployment of slack for CSP also depends on context. Although in previous studies, scholars predominantly defined context based on country-level factors, such country effect would be less apparent for the phenomenon of interest in our study, in which we would like to understand the drivers of CSP in emerging economies. Our literature study guides us to look at the internationalization aspect as resource contingency factors. Internationalization is disproportionately important for the emerging market multinationals because they could leverage CSP as strategy to overcome the internationalization disadvantages namely liability of origin and liability of foreignness. The first factor that we observe is related to the ownership structure of the company. When a company has stronger control, then it may pass the task of allocating resources for CSP to lower level entities while benefit from the positive legitimacy spillover effects. The second resource contingency factor deals with the expansion orientation of the multinationals. The horizontal expansion towards other emerging economies is expected to lessen the deployment of select resources for CSP, as the existing legal framework in the emerging economies would minimize the potential negative spillover effects. Lastly, we look at the importance of competition. While competition in general would stimulate a high CSP because companies would leverage their CSP investment as differentiation strategy, the type of competitors becomes crucial in the emerging economies context. When a company encounters only domestic competitors, then it will be limitedly assessed by the local stakeholders. In contrast, when a company faces foreign rivals, then it will be exposed to more diverse stakeholders and potentially assessed based on international standards. We therefore expect that higher presence of foreign competitors would encourage deployment of select resources for CSP. Following the interest to observe CSP in weak institutional setting, we selected 9 emerging economies and managed to collect data and information for 553 publicly listed companies. These companies are identified as large emerging market multinationals in other studies. To operationalize CSP, we took the ESG score from Thomson Reuters as proxy. In the empirical exercise, we employ 2 different slack resources variables. One is financial slack, which is calculated as cash holdings, and the other is technology slack, which is computed as the difference in R&D spending against industry average. The reason for this distinction is because in a recent study, scholars found that different type of slack may influence CSP differently. In addition to the statistical support for each of the hypotheses, the empirical results also indicate that different contingency factors possibly modify different type of slack resources for CSP. To illustrate the contingency mechanism better, we make the interaction plots, and here is one example of those plots. The one that you see on screen is the interaction plot between technology slack and expansion orientation. As indicated by the blue solid line, the predicted value of CSP increases as technology slack grows for companies with vertical expansion orientation. This finding suggests that when companies expand beyond the emerging economies, they would build a high CSP as technology slack increases. And one of the possible explanations for this is because they recognize the strategic value of their CSP investment. Based on these results, we make 2 policy recommendations, in particular to public policy in emerging economies. First, we recommend governments to expand the notion of societal contribution from corporations beyond just monetary contribution. As we learn from the study that different type of corporate resources may influence CSP differently. Our second recommendation is for the government to take into account the internationalization aspect when formulating CSP policy, rather than just putting a minimum CSR spending, for example. Government might consider to take the role as facilitator of perfect competition, as we just learned that the presence of foreign competitors would positively modify the deployment of select resources into CSP. And with this, I would like to end this presentation, and we kindly ask you to leave any question and suggestion in the comment section. You are also more than welcome to join us in the live showcase to discuss more details. Thank you for your attention and have a great day.